Hello, and thank you for joining this live webinar presented by the Cisco Learning Network. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the Cisco Learning Network, and information on how to access the recording will be emailed to you following the live session. Please allow up to 5 business days for the full recording to be made available. Thank you very much and enjoy the presentation. Hello, and thank you for joining this live webinar presented by the Cisco Learning Network. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the Cisco Learning Network, and information on how to access the recording will be emailed to you following the live session. Please allow up to 5 business days for the full recording to be made available. Thank you very much and enjoy the presentation. Hello, and thank you for joining this live webinar presented by the Cisco Learning Network. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the Cisco Learning Network, and information on how to access the recording will be emailed to you following the live session. Please allow up to 5 business days for the full recording to be made available. Thank you very much and enjoy the presentation.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Hello to everyone and welcome to today's session. My name is Carlo Bobilas and I'll be your moderator. Today's session will be presented by technical leader Brandon Fowler. But before I hand over the mic, I do have a few housekeeping items to cover about today's session. Today's session will be recorded and made available on demand. We'll make sure to provide you with some details at the end. Also, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you are on WebEx and have a question for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the WebEx question and answer panel, where our wonderful panelists are ready to respond. And for those tuning into our live stream, we thank you very much for joining in. Q&A is limited to those via WebEx. However, we will have a post-event Q&A thread over on the Cisco Learning Network community, where you can post any follow-up questions you might have. So without any further ado, I'd like to go ahead and kick things off by welcoming Brandon. Brandon, over to you.
Thanks, Carlo. Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're going to be discussing identity as it relates to Zero Trust architecture. We're going to discuss a little bit about why identity is important and how it relates to Zero Trust architecture, as well as some of the challenges that we've seen commonly from organizations as they've started trying to get a handle on identity, as well as some tips and strategies to try to help address some of those challenges. Starting out, just a little bit about myself. I'm a technical leader, part of the professional services organization here at Cisco. So I'm working with customers every day. So a lot of what we'll discuss here is going to be based off experience of working with customers, trying to help them adapt as they start moving towards zero trust architecture segmentation and similar programs. I joined Cisco in 2018. I've got a little over 15 years of network experience across a pretty broad background of routing, switching, wireless, and security, as well as a number of industry verticals I've had the experience working with, from healthcare, financial, manufacturing, and quite a few more. My main concentration or main focus, especially here at Cisco, as part of professional services, is on identity solutions, network segmentation, public key infrastructure, and network access control. Uh, in my personal life, I love photography. I like being able to get outside in nature, take photos, something to kind of help unwind and get away from the stress and chaos of every day. Also a car enthusiast, and continuing on the theme of wanting to be outside, I enjoy mountain biking as well. Again, just kind of getting out in nature. To start us off, I've got a quote here from Walt Whitman. He's a 19th century American poet, and forgive me, I've uh, paraphrased this a little bit, but in his poem "Song of Myself," he's alludes to how many multitudes he himself has, and I thought that was a good allegory for identity as part of the zero trust, or even within IT overall. Because when we start thinking about identity, it's a fairly basic thing on its premise. But as we start diving deeper, there's a lot of complexities and challenges that might not immediately come to mind. So I want to start out by just defining what identity is, at least as part of what our discussion today is, focused on zero trust architecture. So it's really a collection of attributes about a person or system that's recorded in a way that's contextually relevant to your organization. Um, and those attributes exist to answer really some basic questions. Who or what is trying to access the data on my network? And what's important for us as part of a zero trust architecture or using identity to provide segmentation is, do we have a high level of confidence in those attributes, that data set that we have? And do we have enough granularity to be able to use that data to make decisions that are going to meet our policy and governance requirements? Otherwise, our zero trust plan, our design, and our expected outcomes. So starting out here, I want to do a quick just poll. So if you have the ability, if you could join us, slido.com, you can use the ZT-ID tag there or scan the QR code. I'd like to get an idea if you could rate the level of training and awareness on zero trust, especially around identity management in your organization. I'd love to understand as we get started here, kind of where everybody sits. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute and answering that poll, and then we'll continue on. All right, starting to get some results here. Looks like we're split pretty evenly. Looks like inadequate is starting to take an early lead. Not terribly surprising, but hopefully, as we discuss here today, we'll give some good data points to help you get through some of these challenges here. We'll just give it a few more minutes here. I'd like to see what some more of these results come in as. Okay, so it looks like we have a pretty good representation here. About 2/3 of the folks that participated, and thank you for those that did vote, see that their organization is probably not at the level they need to be when it comes to identity management. And that's something we do hear pretty commonly. So not terribly unexpected. All right, so let's move into what we have as our zero trust capabilities. We also refer to these as the pillars. Obviously, the one we're talking about today is identity. Just to kind of level set here as we start out, we do have the four other pillars: policy and governance, vulnerability management, enforcement, analytics. We're not going to really discuss those today. We had a previous webinar on policy and governance, so there'll be some more information on how to view that at the end of this presentation. And likewise, we'll have additional webinars in the future to cover the other pillars you see there: vulnerability management, enforcement, analytics. So today we're going to focus on just identity. And the first thing I wanted to talk through was to go through these basic capabilities that we see as common and necessary for most organizations. I will caveat here, there may be some instances in your organization where you have legacy equipment or a very niche use case. You may need some additional capabilities beyond what you see on this slide. But again, this covers 98% probably of the use cases. Just something to be aware of. It's not necessarily all inclusive, but should give you a good starting point. So as we look through here, there's some basic platform capabilities that make a ton of sense. AAA, if you're not familiar with the acronym, that's just authentication, authorization, and accounting. Primarily, that's a number of different protocols and capabilities that subsume under AAA that allow us to transmit essentially identity data to make a decision on should we authenticate this person to allow them onto the network or allow access to data, and authorization carries that onward of what level of access should they have, how much can they see, and while that accounting data gives us the ability to load some of that information into our analytics platforms to get an understanding of what are people doing, how long are they accessing data, things like that. So key component. It's going to span, like I mentioned, over a couple different platforms, most likely, or systems, but definitely a key component of identity. Certificate authority is another one, commonly also referred to as PKI or public key infrastructure. This is kind of a complex one for a lot of folks, but one that is absolutely gaining more and more importance as we start seeing more and more things that are encrypted. It's pretty much the standard now that if you're accessing a web page, it's going to be encrypted rather than not. And most of that is built on having a public key infrastructure, having a certificate authority. So another very critical aspect of identity, being able to provide those certificates so that identity data is there when necessary. Network access control, or NAC, again, pretty common one for identity. This is normally your gatekeeper for keeping people on or off the network, whether that's on a premise location or even remote through VPN or another method. So NAC's going to be pretty common. Provisioning. So this is one where I think a lot of times, especially practitioners, professionals within IT will potentially overlook as part of identity. Because we see it as something that's normally already there, right? It kind of comes out of the policy and governance of how do we get people onto the network? How do we add their attributes into like an HR management system? And then it extends beyond that into areas we're more used to dealing with, such as an access request. Hey, I need to be added to a specific security group. But it's important to keep the entire provisioning process in sight as you're going through and looking at identity as part of Zero Trust, because that really is the foundational element of where we start to collect data on identity, and it's our main methodology for managing it and offboarding and making sure that we're controlling the identities that are on the network. In line with that, privileged access, again, very common one. For most administrators at a lot of organizations, you'll have a separate privileged access account. And there'll be systems along with that, privileged access management systems to help support those credentials and allow that differentiated access so that hopefully you're not having to use your same corporate credential to also manage systems. Multi-factor authentication. This is another one that's gained a huge amount of usage, especially with the pandemic and COVID in 2020. A lot of organizations shifted over to remote work, and as part of that mitigation for the risk of having to make such a drastic move so quickly, MFA stepped in as a common component to help mitigate that risk factor. So very common to already have it, but this is an area where it's important to make sure you're getting it right because there's a lot of times you can get user pushback here, depending on things of you'll get responses like, oh well, you need to provide me a phone if I'm going to have a phone app to get onto the network, or I don't want to use this. I'm getting queried way too many times to authenticate. So it's a key component, but it's one that can provide a lot of frustration to your user base. So it's one that really I think needs special attention as you're going through and integrating that component into your zero trust architecture. Asset identity. This one also kind of can be correlated with the configuration. The CMDB there you see below it. A lot of times these are kept in the same system, but both of these are going to be critical. Asset identity, of course, is going to be important for your IoT and OT type assets, things that may not have an interactive user on them in most cases, where you're relying on getting the details about that asset to try to make an identity rather than the user that's actually sitting on it. Similarly, for configuration management database, again, we really need to know what are the components in the network, and especially knowing that they are free from unexpected changes or deviations. So both the CMDB and asset identity are going to be other areas where you'll want to have a very robust build out, it to be well maintained. And that's something that we see as a struggle for a lot of organizations. Finally, IP schemas on this list. This is one that is still used for identity. Traditionally, this is probably the one that comes to mind initially for a lot of folks, just because in the past when we've done segmentation, many times it's been aligned to VLANs, which are generally aligned to subnets. A lot of technological evolution has taken place since this, and it's not really as true anymore. We can now extend like layer 2 subnets to different layer 3 areas. So where before we might have been able to use an IP to say, oh, that's a user in this geographical location, may not be as true anymore. That said, we can still use the IP schema. There may still be use cases where it's important. For example, if you have a third-party vendor, partner, contractor, or services company that are working on your network, the IP that they're coming from, say, they're having to come in through a VDI system rather than VPN, that could be a attribute point that you're going to want to differentiate on. So still some value there, but not as key as it used to be. All right, so for zero trust, the one thing I want to kind of underscore here about identity is it has to be foundational, and it really needs to be ubiquitous. You need to make sure that not only do you have the identity data, but that you can use it in as many places as possible, because what you really want to get to is having as much flexibility as you can when you're defining policy and you get to the enforcement, kind of that meat of the zero trust segmentation type outcome. So I want to move us into looking at some examples of the different providers and consumers of identity, to start to take a look at, what are some of the complexities we're going to look at here. So to start us off, right, we have a number of different providers, and some of these may not be as obvious as they would initially appear to be. Again, HR management systems, I think, are some of the biggest ones. A lot of organizations, when you talk to security or network teams, right, they interact with these HR management systems. So something like Workday, for example, but they tend to do it as part of kind of the regular administrative duties of their job, not necessarily as part of maintaining the network or defining security. But again, these are generally the primary and initial systems where we're entering in user details in that provisioning process. So this is going to be really the foundation for a lot of our identity data later, because in many cases, these HR management systems will sync this initial data set out to other systems, whether they be directory services or other databases, to load that attribute data in for other systems to use them for authentication and identity. Carrying on from that, directory services, this is really common. This is going to be kind of your key one. Everyone's going to have this as kind of an initial thought or starting point when they're starting to look at identity and getting a handle on it in their organization. So these are going to be things like Microsoft Active Directory or LDAP. Large organizations, especially if you have multiple operating systems in use, you're going to have probably both of these or a number of them. And these are normally pretty well integrated already. So actually getting at the data that's there is pretty straightforward. So these are not too bad to have to deal with. Network access control. This is actually an interesting one. If you take a look onto the consumer side, you'll actually see network access control there as well. So you'll have some of these systems where they may actually be both a provider of data and a consumer of data at the same time. And somewhat confusingly, they may actually be providing for another system while consuming from a completely separate system. Just depending on how your infrastructure is built and how your systems are designed and architected today, you can have that issue where you're really looking at one platform that's both providing and consuming data. And so you have to look at it from a perspective of, how do I maintain the identity data that's in here, and how do I ensure that it gets the identity data that it needs for various use cases. The configuration management database, again, very common for most organizations to have one of these, something like ServiceNow. But another thing we commonly see is that the CMDB is never really where the organization wants it to be. It'll either be a problem with out-of-date data, or to be an issue with missing data, or just that the system isn't completely built or the workflows aren't proper. And that can be a really big hindrance for a Zero Trust project, to be honest. The CMDB provides a huge amount of data, especially when we're talking, again, about IoT or OT assets, things that otherwise don't have an interactive user. We need to get that data from somewhere, and those devices themselves, while they're getting better at providing identity about who they are, they're not quite there yet. And of course, we never really want to rely on the device on its own without some sort of an exterior third party to kind of validate or vouch for who it is, right? We don't want to just necessarily take it at its word if it doesn't have a certificate, or it's not passing us some username and password from, again, an interactive user sitting on it. So the CMDB really starts to become very critical there, but is definitely a pain point for a lot of orgs. Public key infrastructure, again, these are primarily user and machine certificates, but these are a great provider of identity data, because they're very hard to, nearly impossible to fake a certificate, barring any type of loss of a private key, which if you have that, obviously, there's some other things to take care of there. But these are very hard to try to steal or reutilize in the wrong way when it's architected properly and you have the right mitigations and configurations in place, while also providing a wealth of data, because they're very open in terms of the fields you can fill out, and how you architect even out the PKI infrastructure. It can make it a lot easier to consume that identity data, as well as giving a benefit to the user base, because as you advance, PKI can be used for other things like passwordless authentications. Might not be there for every system today, but could give a much better user experience. So definitely an area of focus that I would encourage you to really put a lot of time and effort into your PKI infrastructure, make sure it's healthy, make sure you take it into account as you're designing your zero trust architecture, because you can leverage a lot of benefits from that one. A couple of the other minor ones, maybe not as commonly seen, databases. So you can use like ODBC to connect to a lot of these SQL or other structured databases. Again, we don't see a lot of customers that are keeping identity data there, but it's not to say it doesn't happen. MDMs are another one. Generally, these are going to be used for, bring your own device kind of use case. So more limited focus on where users are going to be accessing data, things like email. But again, there's quite a bit that gets pulled in from there, and it's going to always be useful for policy. And then finally, profiling systems are something that are becoming a little bit more common. We see they weren't even just a few years ago. Essentially, an external system that, again, the issues with OT and IoT devices. A lot of these profiling systems have been brought in to help deal with that, of understanding, what are these devices on the network? What are they talking to? Why are they talking to that thing? Much of this can be exposed from these profiling systems as they are placed on your network and can begin to gather data. So moving over to the consumer side, a lot of what you'll see here on the consumer side is really going to be your enforcement and your analytical platforms. So I won't really go through every single one of these. I don't want to kind of read this off to you, but as you can see here, there's a lot of areas where you're going to want to take in that identity data. Obviously, from the enforcement side, we need to take it in so that we can define policy, so that we can actually control the access to the data, right? And we want to do that based off the identity, who that person is, what groups they're in, what division of the business they're in, and ultimately, what are they allowed to see, what are they supposed to see, and what's necessary for their job role. And realistically, the only way the enforcement platform can make a decision at that level is with that level of robust identity data. Looking at the analytical platforms, right? Your SIM, your SOAR, network behavior analytics. These are going to be critical for as you are running your zero trust program and applying segmentation to your network, making sure that it's being done properly, that you don't have areas where you've missed, where people are getting to data they shouldn't be, or any other kind of anomalous situation. Now, obviously, you can do this without identity data. You can find a lot of these problems, but the time it takes to correlate, who that is if you don't have the identity data integrated, adds a huge amount of work and time and delay that just isn't necessary. By integrating that data, you can save a lot of that time, and it may be that the anomalous event was benign, no issues there, but there's always that cost if you use that time, which means you weren't looking at another event, perhaps. So, very very critical aspect for analytics to make sure you've got the identity data there, just so you have that that enrichment to be able to make better decisions. And speaking of enrichment, right, that's really the key of identity. Identity doesn't necessarily solve anything. We're not enforcing anything. We're not going to stop traffic with identity. We're on our own with identity data. We're not going to have any type of, crazy analytical insights. It's an enrichment feed to really all the other systems and all the other pillars. So the idea being that with this extra data, we can provide that flexibility, that granularity, the improved security that we're really looking for to move us from, we'd say legacy segmentation to something zero trust, right? Where we're using identity to make these very specific decisions. So all that leads us into how do we actually get that data between the systems, right? Once we find out where it is in our network or in our organization, how do we allow all of these other systems, the enforcement and the analytical platforms, to call back and get that data so that they can use it to make their decisions? There's two primary methods to make this happen. And realistically, really all API for the most part. Not saying that's the only one, but that's going to be your primary method. But we can split up these API into what is essentially on the left here, more customized work. So you're having to go in and kind of create code yourself versus the vendor specific side where it's a predefined solution, predefined integration that you can leverage without a huge amount of work. So again, looking at the API, this is another area where we've seen a lot of platforms have expanded their use of APIs. They've opened up a lot more things to be able to query and either add in data or pull data from systems. So as you're looking at not only your identity systems, but also your enforcement and analytic platforms and vulnerability management platforms that are going to consume that identity data, you're going to want to have a focus on what are the API capabilities we have, what data does each system need, and do we have a way to provide that data into that system through the API, as well as pull that data out from the provider, again, likely through an API call. So again, if it's not an already integrated solution, it's likely possible through these APIs, but it's going to require some additional work. You'll have to likely write some custom code. In most cases, this is going to have to sit as a middleware. That's going to increase your costs. It increases complexity because it's now another solution you're going to need to maintain. But there are advantages towards taking this approach. Key amongst which is, if the vendor-specific, vendor-provided integration doesn't exist for your use case, you unfortunately really don't have a whole lot of other choice. But by going through the custom route, you can at least create that integration yourself, and you get a lot of flexibility because if you're writing your own code, you can control how you ingest that data, any type of parsing or changes you might need to make for it to work in another system to normalize it, and then how you send that to the other system, as well as some logging components. So you do gain a lot of flexibility in that front, but again, it comes at the cost and complexity price tag there. So the other side of that is the vendor specific, right? So these are the integrations that a vendor provides. It may be between their own platforms. For example, Cisco, we have essentially almost all of our platforms can be integrated with each other. But it could also be between two different vendor systems, right? There's a lot of use cases where they're commonly used together, and those vendor specific integrations will be built out. Again, looking at this is generally the simplest method. These will be kind of predefined integrations. You can just go in, follow a guide to configure them. But in contrast to the manual development, it's pretty much the inverse. While these are easy to build, they may be a little bit too limiting. You're really stuck with whatever they have defined and included in that integration. So if you need more data, or you need data to be modified in a certain way to meet your architecture or your use case, that could be something that it may not provide that flexibility to. Again, that's just something you're going to have to look for. When you are evaluating these solutions, my recommendation is look for any option that at least provides something that's standards-based. So my example here, again, we have a product called Platform Exchange Grid, commonly shortened to PX Grid. So we utilize a WebSocket protocol for sending and receiving the data. And in structuring the data, we use Taxi and Sticks so that it's a standardized structured format that other platforms can easily interpret as they ingest that data. So just a call out there, as you're looking at these, you may or may not have a vendor specific option, but if you're evaluating competing products, I would always recommend standards based over proprietary. So to go into that a little bit more, I'm going to lean on the PX Grid example and talk through a little bit of how we can exchange data for use of identity data, that is, as part of a zero trust architecture. So common scenarios that we see for PXGrid, we've got basically four ways in which we commonly utilize identity data. The first, they're providing data. So this is pretty straightforward. In this case, ICE is the provider. So it has the identity data, and we're providing that to some sort of partner system, right? Whether it be a Cisco system or something else, right? It connects into PXGrid using that WebSocket protocol I mentioned, and then we can provide that contextual identity data out to the external platform. The inverse of that, consumption of data, could also pull that back in. So, right, like I mentioned, you may have some platforms that are both provider and consumer of data. In this example, ICE does do that. And in this case, we can consume that data in from an external partner into ICE. So for using that data in policy. Threat response, that'll be another area where we would want to utilize identity data. So your enforcement platforms again, and in some cases, even your analytics platforms may be able to detect a change in the network, a change in behavior, download a malware file, whatever it may be, right? They can detect that change, reference it back, in this case, to ICE, to another platform to take that mitigation strategy. That may be to quarantine or shut down a network port or change an access control list or whatever that mitigation may be. The point being, right, that identity data exchange is what made that possible to be able to very quickly identify who that user is. Somehow they're outside of the scope of what was defined as acceptable. And so we're leveraging this identity exchange platform to be able to take action on that and actually provide that segmentation enforcement that we're looking for. And finally, probably one of the more powerful ones is going to be data brokerage. So this is where the platform can actually provide the ability for two separate external systems to communicate with each other, where there might not be an integration directly between them, right? So you may end up having these situations where you have two platforms, and they're not really intended or ever expected to talk with each other, but the identity data that they hold may be relevant to another one, in which case you could use something like PXGrid to help facilitate that rather than having to write a specific API. Again, you could kind of create all this on your own if you want to go that custom route with API programming and creation of essentially a middleware. And there's other options also, beyond PXGrid. I'm not trying to say that it's the only one out there. Just giving an example of what is possible with some of these vendor-specific ones. And as we continue to move forward, right, I expect to see more and more of these kind of capabilities, more expansion, tying into cloud systems, tying into SaaS systems, things like that, that otherwise, right, they're still kind of working on building out, but it'll be critical as we start to look at zero trust across, anywhere we have data. So going to move us into one more poll here. This will be the last one for this webinar. So again, if you don't mind joining us, what I'd like to ask here and get some feedback from our participants is, what do you see as the biggest challenge in managing identities within a zero trust framework? And I've got another there. If you have access to the chat, if there's something that came out of what we already talked about that you kind of see, I'd love to hear that as well. All right, starting to get a couple of results here. So it looks like, at least early out here, we're seeing that balancing security with the user experience is a big challenge, but also integrating a legacy system seems to be very common. as a common issue. And I'm certain there's quite a few folks who are disappointed they can't make the multiple choices here. So I apologize that I'm kind of forcing you into a single option here. All right. So as we look here, it's interesting. We got about a pretty even tie for first place here, uh, between balancing the security with the user experience and integrating legacy systems. And I think that makes sense. The complexity of managing multiple identities definitely a concern. Uh, Generally, a little bit more constrained. Normally, we only see those with kind of privileged accounts. Although you could have some issues in mergers and acquisitions, if you're trying to onboard new companies, of course, with combining identities. Um, but yeah, the balancing security with user experience, certainly, right? As mentioned with MFA, that can be a really easy touch point with users to kind of cause some friction. Um, and integrating the legacy systems, of course, as we talked about, right? There's a lot of complexities there with whether you're going to use API vendor specific integrations. Do those vendor specific integrations exist? So um, hopefully, a little bit of what we've talked about has kind of helped. Maybe not answer those questions yet, but at least exposed all the different variables we need to take into account as we're looking at identity. All right, so I wanted to finish out here with some tips on how to get started. So as we talked about, there's a lot of challenges. Unfortunately, I don't have the time today to really go through every single common challenge and all uh, the different strategies to help mitigate or get past those challenges. But I wanted to start with just where would I get started if I haven't done anything with identity at all yet around zero trust. I don't know where anything's at. My recommendation is to start there, right? Figure out where your organization's identity data lives. And I'm gonna reference back to that list of providers we saw. That may not be an all-inclusive list. You will likely have legacy systems that may have local user authentication where those identities are only stored on that platform, and they may not have a good way to get the data out of that platform. Likewise, if you are an organization that still uses mainframes, um, commonly all of those credentials are managed through RACF, right? And that's the only place it can be. And getting data out of there again can be difficult. These are systems that do get updated, but they are quite old in their foundations. So there could be limitations there from the architecture. So it's really important to when you're looking at your organization and you're trying to figure out where identity data lives today. Don't focus up too much on just the ones that are they're obvious, like your directory services systems. Make sure you're looking outwardly at some of these other legacy or maybe niche and small use case systems you may have. Make sure you're not missing anything there in terms of, at the very least, controlling those users and their access to the data that's on those platforms to make sure you're providing appropriate protection there. And again, going back to the CMDB, right, that'll be another area where hopefully if you have a well-structured, up-to-date CMDB, you can get some of that information fairly simply, but you may have to do some digging here. Next step is going to be document what attributes you have available. So look at those systems and figure out what attributes do they have in them today. What are they collecting about that user or about that machine that we could potentially utilize either in an enforcement or analytical or vulnerability management context. Once we have that data, then you're going to want to take those attributes and compare them against your zero trust architecture plan. So hopefully, again, if you haven't, would recommend you look at the last webinar on policy and governance. Zero trust kind of lives and dies, in my opinion, based off policy. If you don't have the authority from your organization to really make the changes, it's going to be very difficult to push forward on this, right? So what you want to do is take that zero trust policy, all those outcomes you've already defined, and you want to compare them with the attributes that you have in these different identity systems, and see where those attributes are going to be needed within your plan. Again, within those other elements, within the enforcement systems or the analytical systems, to understand, okay, I have the data today. Where do I need to get it to? Once you have all that data together, then you got to look for your gaps. So do you have areas where you've clearly identified, this system should have the attribute in it, it doesn't for some reason, or potentially it has the attribute, but I have no way to get that data out, right? Either of these are going to be an issue, and they just need to be notated down, and you got to have that on the roadmap to find a way to remediate it. It could be that you would need a platform upgrade. It could be you need to develop some middleware API, right? There's a lot of potential solutions to it, but the ultimate goal here is to surface that and make sure you have it on your radar. Final step here, you need to update it, right? So once you identify these data stores, these identity stores that are missing attributes, then it's a matter of rectifying that. So either manually inputting the data, or preferably developing automated ingestion, so that you can regularly pull that data in and really solidify as part of your zero trust architecture. All right. So to wrap up here, like I said, we have a limited amount of time with just a 1 hour webinar to go through this. Hopefully, this has helped kind of surface some of the difficulties, some of the challenges that you may have. I was lucky enough to write with a cadre of excellent co-authors a book on zero trust architecture, and the intent of this book is again around how to implement zero trust based off what we, as part of professional services and as part of Cisco, have seen as challenges from our customers. And hopefully, if you need some more information, this book could be a good reference for you. Also, as I mentioned earlier, there was a previous webinar that was presented by my colleague David Hauk. So if you did not get a chance to see that live, the link is available there. I would highly encourage you to go look at it. Further, this is one webinar and a series of webinars. We'll have another one on vulnerability management. That'll be presented by Ken Kensel. So if you'd like to register to continue following along with these webinars and learning on zero trust, that information is available there. I would highly recommend it. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap our presentation and take a look at the Q&A panel here and see if we have any outstanding items.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Brandon. As a reminder, if you do have a question for Brandon, feel free to go ahead and put it in the Q&A panel. Okay. So as we wait for questions to come, I do want to point out that I placed the link to the previous recording post-discussion thread over on the Cisco Learning Network in the chat space. I'll also link all session information, so future sessions will be linked to at the bottom of each of those post-webinar discussion threads. You'll find the recordings along with the slides. So for today's session, I'll make sure to link that or add that to the post after the session ends. And you can also register. There's links to register as well as obtain that Zero Trust book. Information's all there. Okay, Brandon, first question I do see here is, what is Zero Trust and how does identity play a role in it?
Sure. So zero trust really is a pretty expansive term, right? Depending on who's answering it. A lot of folks, I think, have been a little beat down by it as a marketing term, but essentially, zero trust is a shift in the security architecture, right? Moving away from the kind of traditional or legacy hard exterior. So firewalls at the edge, right? And then having most of your internal network being open. It's a move towards segmentation, but beyond that, segmentation that is again granular and more informed by ultimately identity data, right? And so that's where identity plays the biggest role in the zero trust part of segmentation, and that evolution of an organization is being able to provide that relevant context of who that person is and who they are to the organization, and what that data that they should be allowed to access is, because ultimately that's our biggest concern here, right? In all of this is it's just protecting data. It's keeping it out of the wrong hands, and by integrating that identity data, you know, we have the tools we need to be able to make those granular decisions to really protect the organization.
Thank you very much. Moving on to our next question is how can organizations ensure strong identity verification as part of their zero trust strategy?
Certainly. So that's an excellent question. My first response there is always going to be again strong policy. It's not certainly the exciting thing, right? It's not the big win that most people want to send out. When you turn on enforcement, you really start to block something. But really, none of this is successful if you don't have robust policy behind it in terms of, how are we going to protect data, right? What is everyone's responsibility for protecting data? To what extent do we need to have this segmentation and these enforcement mechanisms in place? That's truly really kind of the key element, is making sure you have that foundational policy that you can build off of. So as you start to instantiate your enforcement platforms and your analytical platforms, you have all the necessary pieces in place to be able to ensure that you can get those data to those platforms and put on the mitigations and the enforcements and policy that's necessary to protect the data.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, next question. What are the challenges in managing identities in a zero trust environment?
Yeah, another great question. So this kind of goes back to the examples we had about just the vast number of providers and consumers we have. The first piece is, right, we have a lot of identity data, but in most cases it's going to be spread out across multiple systems, and as I mentioned, in a lot of cases it may be on systems we're not even thinking about. Smaller legacy systems, or these kind of niche use cases that every organization seems to have. The other aspect of it, though, is really the multiple identities, right? Um, as mentioned, privileged accounts will generally be separated. So a user might, as an administrator, have two accounts. They might have four, five, six accounts. All those need to be managed. They all need to be properly delineated between each other, so that there's no carryover. Especially with these privileged admin accounts, you do not want to, have too much rights associated with them. Right, just the amount needed to fulfill that role, that job requirement. And then the final aspect I see as a really big issue comes around provisioning, right? And it's not just the initial provisioning, but just the ongoing life cycle of identity, making sure that you are keeping up with changes, and especially with offboarding. It's an area where we've seen it a lot in the news of, an account wasn't properly cleaned up, and a former employee may be disgruntled and try to come in and may actually do some sort of damage, or try to steal data from a network. So that provisioning process, while on the face of it is really simple, is an easy area where if you're not very careful and don't have very, very structured policies and standards, you could have a real issue, even if you do everything else right.
Okay, thank you. All right. And then for this next question, feel free for any of the panelists to unmute their microphones and talk about it. One of our attendees asked, could updating identity attributes become problematic due to a large number of devices in a big company?
Yeah, so I'll start out here. Certainly it can. And the biggest example I'd give of this would be an automated one that wasn't expected. So, I mean, I can give a pretty basic example. In a lot of network access control systems, there'll be a feed service for identifying devices based off like an OUI, right? So it's an OUI, which, if you're not familiar with it, right, it's the first half of a MAC address that's normally sold to an organization to help them identify a device by that physical address. But as we commonly see, right, a lot of organizations go through mergers and acquisitions and consolidations between others. So these OUIs can update. If we're using something like that as a conditional for policy and that updates without us expecting it, we didn't see the news that, hey, these two organizations merged and the new org decided that they were going to update the OUI and pull it into their name, right? That push could go out automated. You might not see it in the first instance you have is a bunch of devices don't hit their expected policy and go offline. So it's a really great point of making sure you understand what can modify identity attributes, how it can modify them, and when it's likely to do so, um, as well as understanding when something goes anomalous. So if that update doesn't work, right, there needs to be some way to log that and bring that to someone's attention as an alarm. So definitely a great question. Certainly something to keep in mind, as it is a possibility of creating some issues or problems within an org.
Thank you very much. Okay, moving on. Next question is, what technologies are crucial for identity management in a zero trust architecture?
Sure. So this goes back to really uh, our pillar list, right? So the technology you can kind of see here. I switched back the slide deck. These capabilities are really what we see as the key common ones that are necessary for ensuring you have identity well covered in a zero trust architecture. Again, that's not to say these are all of them. You may have others depending on your specific use case or your specific architecture, organization, legacy devices. But these that we see here are the common ones that we feel every organization needs to have to be successful.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Okay, looks like I have one more question. How does identity management contribute to compliance in a zero trust model?
Yeah, absolutely. So we see a number of different regulatory requirements. PCI is a really common one that tends to uh, cross a number of different verticals where that identity data contributes heavily towards supporting audits and supporting uh, different regulatory and compliance requirements. Because we can ultimately say through logs that it wasn't just this random IP address that accessed a specific piece of data, but rather it's this user. This user was a valid employee. This user was part of the group, right? They went through the provisioning process. They went through the appropriate approvals to get access, right? So it fills in kind of that missing link that would otherwise be a very manual effort in trying to respond and make sure you're complying with a lot of these regulatory requirements by uh, integrating that data and providing that identity enrichment. You really strengthen those cases and can take a lot of workload off of some of those governance and compliance folks, which will probably be a big benefit and something they'd be thrilled to have.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Brandon. All right, it looks like we've covered all our questions. Brandon, is there anything else you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that attended today. I hope this was a good use of your time. Hopefully, we gave you some extra ideas and strategies on how to approach identity as part of your zero trust efforts in your organization. And would strongly encourage everyone to stay with us for the future webinars to keep learning and advancing uh, their zero trust programs.
Great. Thank you very much, Brandon. Thank you to our panelists and the whole team for bringing your knowledge to the Cisco community. Again, if you have a question, I'll keep the Q&A window open for a couple more minutes. Also, you can join us on the Cisco Learning Network on that post-event discussion thread. to follow up and if anything comes to mind. For even more tutorials, demonstrations, and future webinars, do visit the Cisco Learning Network. That link is in the chat. Your feedback is important. At this time, you'll be directed to a survey. So we do encourage you to take the time to participate. Let us know how we did. Let us know what topics you'd like to discuss in future sessions. Once again, we thank everyone for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much.